Welcome to the Lansdowne Library's Geek Out podcast, where we geek out about just about anything. I'm one of your hosts, Jeff.
And I'm your other host, David.
Today, we're going to be talking about what is referred to by many as one of the greatest shows of all times and a receiver of 16 Emmy Awards, Mad Men.
Now, before we deep dive into that, let's introduce our guests for today.
I'm Bill Patterson, the director of the Lansdowne Library.
And I'm Christina. I'm a reference librarian here at Lansdowne.
So let's get into it with the question on everybody's mind. What is Mad Men?
I guess we could take it two different ways, Dave. We could talk about what the terminology means and also what the show is about. So the terminology Mad Men, which they introduced in the first episode, refers to the term that these men in advertising coined for themselves. So Mad Men referring to Madison Avenue. Mad Men itself is a show that really Don Draper is the focus, and he's an ad executive in New York City. Starts out in 1959, and we get to see his life and also the lives of those he works with and his progression through all of the 60s up until 1970. So I'm probably summarizing it very briefly, but there's so much to the story, to his life, to his background, to his family of origin, and his current family. And the show kind of looks at all that in the context of what's going on in the culture at that time and history at that time.
I never knew that mad, I thought it just referred to...
They were crazy?
Yeah, I mean, as someone who's going into this totally blind, you know, seeing it, I was like, okay, 50s, guys in suits, probably business. I guess I pictured something more along the lines of Wolf of Wall Street, but set in the 60s, so...
Dave, that's a really interesting comparison because I was just talking about that. That Wolf of Wall Street kind of showed the decadent, almost over-the-top nature of working in New York City at that time in the 80s. And while this is a little bit more tamer, they don't get quite to eating goldfish. It is much more, carousing, drinking, smoking, the cheating on the wives, the being with the secretaries, things of that nature. So it is kind of similar to some extent, just not as maybe over-the-top and graphic as Wolf of Wall Street.
Is it HBO? Is that what it was on? Or
it's on AMC.
Yeah, it was originally an AMC production.
Right. And it was on AMC before Breaking Bad, before The Walking Dead, so it really put that station on the map, because before that it used to be called American Movie Classics, and they would show a lot of classic films, and then they would show a lot of, foo-foo films, maybe action films. And then Mad Men was one of their first scripted dramas, and it really put the station on the map. But HBO, it was pitched to HBO, and Matt Weiner, who is the creator, pitched it to HBO, and HBO passed, which was a good move in my opinion, because it could have been a totally different show, and I think that that AMC was a great place for it.
So when it comes to Mad Men, what is it about this show that stands out to you? What's your favorite aspect of the show?
That's a good question. That's pretty hard. It's hard to pick between the writing and the acting. They're both really phenomenal. The writing is really good without being over the top. A lot of times when people talk about something having a lot of great repartee or whatever, it does feel kind of scripted, especially if you think about movies from the 50s and 60s where it's just this like rapid fire thing. And it's really well written, but you can tell that it's written. I feel like this feels more natural to me. It is really well written, both the dialogue and things as it's moving, but also the overall arc is really outstanding and very satisfying. But the acting is really, really good too, especially John Hamm. But there are a lot of really outstanding performances throughout the series, I think.
I would agree with Bill with that. I think with John Hamm, he's so good at it that I think he's almost potentially been typecast. He has done some films, most recently Top Gun, and I think that for a lot of people, he'll never not be associated with that role. He did win an Emmy for it. And I agree with Bill. The acting, the writing is really well done. Elizabeth Olsen, who's in it, who plays Peggy, she's also on The Handmaid's Tale. She's a terrific actress. Also, the set design, the costuming, the props, everything about the show. You're not just paying attention to the action, the dialogue. You're looking around and seeing all of the artifacts, the appliances, the wallpaper, the couches. So those things are really true to the period, and I think it's almost like a moving piece of art, between those aspects. So to me, the set design, the costuming, the acting, the dialogue, everything is great about it. I can't really say, it's hard for me to pick. It's like saying, I don't have children, but I would imagine it's that question like, who's your favorite child? to really pick something that you love better than the others from those aspects is difficult. It's just a really well done show.
Yeah, I think you have a good point too with the sets and all. As a period piece, it's really a masterpiece. And my understanding is that they were very meticulous with the accuracy of this piece of furniture, or whatever, in terms of being historically accurate and not anachronistic.
A lot of thought went into it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I can imagine for a show that is ostensibly about advertisers that, getting the right products in the scene would be kind of vital to making things fit the time period.
Absolutely. And that's what's so interesting about it, too, is that they do have a lot of products. When you would watch TV shows and someone would crack open a soda, it was always no name on the label. But in Mad Men, they're doing advertising campaigns for real products. So you see Heinz, Hershey's, I'm trying to think of some others off the top of my head. Some cigarette brands, because this is the 50s and 60s, so that does come up.
Probably Laramets or Lucky Strike.
Lucky Strike is the major account. Very good. Yes. So Legs Pantyhose. So these are all Life cereal. So you see the placement and advertising for those products, which I find so interesting.
On the subject of historical accuracy, obviously it's, like you said, it's a period piece. It takes place during the 60s in America, which, to put it lightly, a lot of things happen. How does that come into the show? Obviously it's New York. These are ad businessmen, but the political climate had to shape it somewhat. So how does the show handle major historical events or portray them, if at all?
Yeah, that's a great question, and Christina, I bet you're going to have some more to say than I will. I want to just start off here. They weave some really important historical events into the storyline, probably a lot more than I realized, because I watched this in 2015, and I've been catching up in preparation for talking about it. But some of the things I noticed were, in the very beginning, they're talking about research and government action on cigarettes. They're realizing that it's dangerous, and they know, and now there's restrictions of how they can advertise, so that was a real thing. The moon landing is in there. The Vietnam War is pretty important. There are probably some other really important historical moments. I think the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. was in there, and probably a lot more things. So it's really woven in. They use it to help drive the plot forward, and I'm not sure quite what I want to say here, but it's very integral, I think, to the plotting.
Yeah, I think it is. At some points, it is very integral to the plot, and sometimes it's just the background. It's on the television. A character's reacting to it. So there's an episode in the first season called Nixon versus Kennedy. So a lot of the first season deals with that whole election, which, I'm not going to say when I was born, but that was several decades before I was born. So not that it's necessarily truth-telling, but it was an interesting insight into the campaign for that and how, TV versus radio. So that was one of the events that was focused in on. They talk about things like the Kent State shooting in the 60s. And the other ones that Bill mentioned as well. So Dave had mentioned that this goes the span of the 60s. And it's so interesting to see how the show starts out to where it winds up. So Don Draper, is the main character. In the beginning, you see him when we first open up on the scene, episode 1. He's sitting in a restaurant smoking alone. He's in a suit with his, I guess that's brow cream in his hair. His hair is all slicked back. It's clearly the 1950s, the end of the 1950s. By the end of the series, we see communes and hippies and the civil rights movement, more feminist movement. So there is a lot of change, and it does affect all of the characters. So I've mentioned, we've kind of touched briefly on Don. Don is the central character, Donald Draper. He is not who you think he is. He actually has a different name. Spoiler, you will find that out very soon into the series. The other character is Peggy Olson, which I would argue her character is almost just as central to Mad Men itself. And she is someone who starts out as a secretary. So it's interesting to see the progression of a girl who just got out of secretary school and winds up being a creative director, almost a creative director by the end. So that was fascinating. Just the role of women in these male-dominated fields. So we talked about it being called Mad Men. However, Matthew Weiner, who's the creator of the show, did a great job of writing these amazing parts for these female actors. So there's the one actor who plays Don's wife, and that's Betty Draper. And she is like the traditional stay-home wife, taking care of the kids. She's not what she seems either. I think that's the key to this show, is not everyone is what they seem. And that's probably very true to life. But she's also a very strong character despite being seen in a traditional female role. But we could talk about all the different characters. I just wanted to point out that it's, even though it's male-focused, I think the female aspect of it is pretty strong.
And you mentioned the counterculture elements too. That's another interesting aspect of the show for me. You have these characters, some of them are very traditional outwardly, and they wind up dabbling in different aspects of the counterculture in a way that surprises them and maybe the audience too. I appreciated that.
While we're speaking of characters, which characters did you resonate with? Who did you connect with? Who did you actually, root for as the series progresses?
That's a good question. I'm going to take the two easiest ones. And you can take them too. But I think Don and Peggy. And for me, rewatching it and not seeing all the details this time, maybe it took me a little longer to warm up to Don. He has a lot of flaws, but definitely by the end, he had a lot of my sympathy. And despite his, obvious and sometimes pretty bad flaws, I concluded that ultimately he's a pretty stand-up guy and he does a lot to help people. As much as it might seem that he is, he's not always just looking out for himself. He does a lot of things for the people throughout the show, and he grows a lot. Although I think you don't always like him if you're paying attention. Peggy is probably more sympathetic from the beginning. She gets maybe a little bit of a harder edge as you go, but I think that's understandable and justifiable, and I think it's part of why she's able to succeed in that male-dominated world.
Well, I would agree. You picked two really good characters. I really like Trudy. Trudy Campbell there's a character named Pete. And Bill and I were talking before about how Pete is kind of like the lapdog to Don. He wants Don's position. He's always at Don's feet. He's trying to usurp his position. I think he would like to be the creative director, the head of creative. But his wife is named Trudy. And what I like about Trudy is initially there's this idea that she might be like a Betty, a stay-at-home wife, very demure, does what she has to do, shows up at parties, is the hostess. But I like Trudy because she does not take any grief. Let's put it that way. Towards the end, I'm not going to give anything away. Her and Pete have trials and tribulations. And that's the other thing. This show depicts marriages that, unfortunately, they go through ups and downs. And I think in some way that is kind of realistic. That does happen. We see divorce in this show, which, again, maybe if you think about the 50s and 60s more like we're seeing the beginning of divorces and quote-unquote broken homes. But with Trudy, she just stood her ground with her husband. I think she was a strong female character. Even Betty, I do have a lot of sympathy for Betty. As I mentioned, she had to deal a lot with Don's wanderings. Don is a complex character, and I agree with Bill that he is at his core good, but he went through a lot of childhood trauma that I think may explain, not excuse, but explain the way in which he behaves. There's so many characters to like, but there's a lot to hate, so I'm happy to, not hate, but dislike. So I'm happy to discuss those.
It does sound like a lot of the cast members are, even, our hero, for lack of a better word here, Don, is full of, let's just call them negative qualities. So, conversely, we have characters who, like Don, you see their growth, so you kind of sympathize more. But what about characters who just throughout it are loathable? Just the characters you love to hate?
I have to think about that a little bit more.
I can go right to it. There's a character named Duck Phillips. And I think that a lot of people, I have to mention I am in 2 Mad Men online groups, and there is a lot of consensus that he is the worst, and mainly for the fact that he abandons his dog.
That's a pretty easy way to get me to hate a character, actually.
Yeah, he had a drinking problem, and he got sober, but then he lapsed again. His wife was divorcing him, leaving him with the dog. So he had the dog at the office and everybody liked the dog for a little while. And then one day, he decides to have a drink. And he takes the dog downstairs to the lobby, opens up the door, unhooks the leash, and just leaves the dog. And the dog stands there and looks for maybe a few seconds. Duck is just, there's nothing really, he's a great actor. I don't remember his name. The gentleman who plays, I think he was in Desperate Housewives too. It might be Mark Mosley, I think. He does a great job at being a character that you're like, ooh. So he's one. I would say another one for me is Harry Crane. Harry is another advertising executive. He might be an account man, Harry Crane. And right from the beginning, he's a cheater on his wife. And I don't even know if we get too much exposure to Jennifer, his wife, but he's always finding someone and creeping in on someone. Every time someone comes to the office for casting, He's right up in her face asking her questions if she has representation. So he's kind of a sleazeball in my mind. Those two stick out right away for me.
Yeah, those are good points. I remember really disliking Duck. I didn't see all the episodes with him the second time around, but I didn't find any sympathetic qualities when I was rewatching. I also thought he was often kind of bluffing his way through, and it's pretty clear that he's very arrogant and entitled. To me, those are really his most obvious qualities that are very unlikable. I agree also about, what was it, Harry?
Harry Crane,
I don't like him too much. And also, I forget his name, but Peggy's boss at McCann, toward the end, the one that's, he's not paying attention to the ideas about the clock campaign, the watch campaign.
Right.
He's just really dismissive. I don't recall his name,
okay.
But I didn't seem very thoughtful. He seemed like he was kind of phoning it in, and even when she was presenting a clearly brilliant idea, he's like, well, we already submitted the idea, it's done, who cares?
Right.
Which is not the way you should be doing things. And I thought he was really dismissing her and kind of ignoring her brilliance. Although in this one case, the slogan was not hers. She later recognized that it was the better one. She wanted to go with it, but he didn't care because they already submitted their thing. They already did their part. Also, in the beginning, I really did, this is not the question, but I really did not like Pete in the beginning. I did start to like him over the course of the show, especially toward the end where you could see his growth and then he started to realize his mistakes, especially with cheating on his wife and why that was not how he wanted to live. But in the beginning, especially, I really felt like he was trying to be Don's lapdog, and while he did want his position, he was happy to curry favor and just kind of tag along as long as he would be allowed to. But Don seemed kind of disgusted or at least put off by that and really didn't want that, and he kind of pushes him away. I think he probably could, if he wanted to, he could have used them more to his advantage if he had been a little bit more, I don't know, not unscrupulous, but that also, but more shrewd, a bit more shrewd about it. He probably could have gotten more out of Pete and made Pete less of a potential threat down the line. Over time, I did start to like him. At the beginning, especially, I found him just endlessly irritating. Really couldn't stand him, but he does get better.
I think, yeah, that's a good point. I think that's a real tribute to the show and the writing, and that these characters really evolve. So, you know how you watch a lot of TV shows, and of course, maybe it's situational comedies. You know, there's a shtick. This guy's the crazy uncle. This person's like the fun dad or something like that. And that's who they are for the whole series. But what I like about Mad Men, which is true to life to some extent, we all change and evolve. And life circumstances change us. So all that historical context, all the relationships, you know, they change a person. So I think that it's really neat that who we see in the beginning of Mad Men, maybe Don to some extent is still Don. But Peggy's different, Pete's different. They've learned from life and what they've gone through. So I think it's a real tribute to the show that they evolved those characters and they didn't stay in those niches. Another thing that I really enjoyed, and I've mentioned this talking about it, is the show doesn't engage in like these typical tropes as well, like putting two characters together like Peggy and Don. They spend a lot of time together. You know, in the beginning, she tries to initiate something with him because she thinks that's the way it is in the office. And he says, no, I'm your boss, not your boyfriend. So I like that they kind of kept the line there and they never crossed it. When other shows might put them together because they're the two lead characters, they work closely, they drink, maybe they have a relationship, but they did not do that. So I really appreciate the writing and the character development.
I do feel like that is kind of a rarity in modern media, especially that we have the male and female leads not in a romantic relationship. So yeah, that is kind of a very nice breath of fresh air.
It's refreshing to see a platonic relationship between people of opposite genders.
Yeah, especially it's something in a period drama that feels like that just never happens.
No, and it's actually one of real respect, I feel like. In the beginning, Peggy's learning the ropes and Don's tough on her. He's very tough on her. And I don't know if that toughness is because he's trying to help her or he's just being mean to her. I tend to think that he's trying to help her. So, yeah, I don't know where I was going with that, but
I agree with you. I think it might be both, or at least I think he's trying to help her, but I think he's hard on everyone, including himself.
Right.
I think he expects a lot, and he works himself really hard, and he expects the same from everyone else. So I think that's part of it. I think probably occasionally he's being mean too, because he can take things out on people. But I think a lot of it is just very high expectation. Mm-hmm. But also, as far as Peggy goes, you mentioned that she did try to initiate something with him, and I just want to point out that that's true. But that was the message that she was picking up. She seemed very uncomfortable with that.
Oh, yeah.
She was getting the message right away from both male and female characters of what kind of things are expected here, beauty standards, dressing, and behavior, and things like that. So I think she felt kind of pushed into that. And I think she was relieved when he brushed her off. But I think she was willing to kind of play ball to get by in this world. But he didn't take her up on that. And it would have been easy to use that dynamic and kind of make that the center and just kind of goes on that, but they didn't.
Well, you bring up a good point of another character that we haven't talked about is Joan.
Yeah.
And Joan is, how do I describe her? She's the head of all secretaries. That's probably, I don't know, she just knows everything about the office. She knows where all the dirty secrets and the bodies are kept. I conflated those ideas, but she knows everything, and she teaches Peggy, and she's also kind of hard on Peggy too.
Yeah.
But it could be some of her own anger. I think in this show there's a lot of repression. There's a lot of repressed emotions because at that time, think about it, it wasn't common to have therapy or to talk in therapy or cry or express yourself. Yeah, so with Joan, she can be tough. And I think part of it was she was maybe angry that she wasn't further ahead maybe, but also she thought she probably was helping Peggy too at the same time. We do hear her say, I'm only trying to help you, dear. But it's very clear from Peggy's first day, from when she gets in the elevator, that the line is that, why don't we take the slow ride up? I'm enjoying the view. So as soon as we get into this show, we know what kind of world we're walking into. It's a world that's so unlike, or maybe still unfortunately like in some regards, some places, that's so unlike what we may be used to now.
Yeah, that's a good point. And as far as Joan, that reminds me of the episode where Roger's mother dies. His secretary is very upset, much more than he is. But at one point in that conversation, when he's finding out, he says, talk to Joan. She'll know what to do. And I kind of felt like he was saying, talk to Mom. She'll know what to do. Kind of looking at her sort of a parent in a way. Someone that you expect to just know what to do and take care of it.
Right.
And also it was that way when, how do I say this? When they were striking out on their own and they brought Joan along and she knew all this stuff that they didn't know where anything was. They needed to take supplies and, contacts and things. That's kind of a complicated situation. Maybe you want to jump into that later and explain maybe. But they wound up relying on her for a lot of the basic stuff that they would not have been able to function without her. And then also, I think it was in that same episode where his mother died, he was spending time with a lady who was another character's mother, and she said something to him to the effect of, please don't ask me to take care of you. I thought maybe they were trying to kind of make a point about masculinity at the time and kind of relying on women for a lot of this caretaking and to kind of, in a way, to let you as the man be a child in some domains, which I think they were trying to critique there, and I think was very real.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting point that I feel like doesn't get made in a lot of other media, and especially coming from a period piece. That's a great way to frame it, and in many ways just bring light to those sort of concepts and issues.
Yeah, it was interesting. There's a lot in the show about the casual and really entrenched sexism and the dynamics, which are much more rigid at the time. But it's also interesting to watch the women characters and the girls, but mostly women, how they deal with that stuff. And a lot of things they let it go past them, and they try to work around it rather than trying to fight most individual things. Although there are characters that do definitely fight for themselves, but just this kind of constant. This is the world. It was the atmosphere they were in. It was so permeated by it that people perpetrating it don't even a lot of times notice what they're doing. They certainly shouldn't see anything wrong with it.
Yeah, we see that with Joan a lot. Joan is, you can't talk about Joan. I talk about her first for her fierceness and, she's a boss. But Joan is looked at as this buxom, beautiful. There's an episode where they talk about brassiers and they're advertising that. Are you a Jackie or a Marilyn? And Joan is more of a Marilyn type of voluptuous figure. So she is subjected to an extraordinary amount of inappropriate comments and jokes, even towards the end of the show. And it's almost cringy to watch the way people talk to her, given her status. Now, she ascends in the ranks as time goes on. But we do see her at the end fight. So she does fight and make herself known, but she still is paid off to leave, essentially. So she tries. But there's only still so much a woman can do at that point in time. So I think Joan, I have a lot of sympathy for her as well. I mean, she felt a pressure, I believe, to get married, although she had been married when she was younger, to essentially, this is a tough topic, but she essentially married her rapist. there is a very tough episode to watch, and that does happen. And you think to yourself, well, why would someone do something like that? And there's many factors, and anybody could psychoanalyze it, but, why would a woman at that time feel compelled to do such a thing? And maybe it's her advancing age. There is an episode where they photocopy her driver's license and put it up in the bulletin board, the girls do, and circle her what year she was born, because there is that pressure on a woman of a certain age to maybe be married or what's going on with her, at that point in her life. So again, I'm sorry about that tough topic, but this show does explore some tough issues such as suicide, drug use, death. So these are, we think of them kind of drinking and dancing around and smoking, maybe having fun, partying with women and things like that. But there are some serious, tough topics. Mental illness being one of them too. There's a character named Ginsberg. He's really a creative genius, but we see his descent into madness, really, and how he was treated, or how we imagine he was treated when he was hauled off, handcuffed to a bed. So these are things, not to bring the mood down, but I like that it doesn't ignore those. We're not living in the 1950s of, Leave It to Beaver or the Donna Reed Show, which are great shows. However, that's not the reality. That doesn't show sexism, racism, homophobia, mental illness, things of that nature.
It's crucial to remember it is a drama series.
Yes.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, there's a lot of drama. Not at all. You do laugh, though. There's some funny lines. Roger Sterling is another awesome. We didn't even talk about Roger. Roger is another great character. There's actually a book called Sterling's Gold, not going to lie, borrowed it from the library, back in the day when it came out. And it's basically just the character's quips. He's so fun. He has all these one-liners. He's truly a joy. I mean, even though he still carouses and does what he does and says what he says, there's something just so fun and entertaining about him. He makes situations much lighter.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Although he takes his job very seriously, and especially making money, he does provide a lot of the comic relief. He says a lot of unexpected things, and he grows in a pretty unexpected way. But you can usually rely on him to be entertaining at the very least.
Yes. And not in a hokey, let me just say this, it's not hokey, where he's making these corny jokes, but it's just intelligent. Double entendres, there's a lot of that. And I think sometimes that type of humor is a little bit smarter. So he's just always someone when he's in the scene, it's going to be good. And it's the same with John Hamm. I mean, I know in real life that, again, I follow, not stalk them, but I know that they're friends in real life. So I think that friendship, that camaraderie, and I've seen him interview John Hamm, and he's talked about that was the first person he really felt like he bonded with. And you can tell there's a real charismatic friendship, or I don't want to say attraction or bromance. I hate to use those words, but they really do connect with each other in a way. And they have a good bounce off of each other. So, yeah, I didn't even talk about Roger, but he's Sterling's Gold. I don't know if it's still available in hardback or paperback.
Well, I can say with certainty there are 2 copies available in the Delaware County Library system.
I love that we linked this podcast to the library and the catalog.
Well, I didn't even check if you can borrow it. I'm assuming one of us has to have it.
Yeah.
Where can you find it these days anyway? Does AMC have a streaming? Is that tied to anybody?
It was on Prime and now it's on Freevee, which is formerly IMDb TV, I believe. You can watch it with commercials, but I'm not going to lie, I own 2 sets of it. One is a Blu-ray, all the different seasons I bought them. And then I bought the collection where you get all the bonus discs and you get the glasses that they used in the show with coasters. So when you watch it, there is this, in my groups that I'm online with, there is this I don't know if you're almost propelled to want to have, I don't know, a brandy or his favorite is an old fashioned. So there's a lot of, and Betty's is a vodka gimlet. So you almost feel like, I'll pour myself a glass and watch the show. But yeah, so you can access it. It used to, I think, be on Prime. And I don't know about AMC streaming because I don't have that. But thank God for the DVDs.
They have their own.
Not yet.
Yeah, give them a minute, I'm sure.
Yeah, so you can access it that way for free if you have access to Freevee, if you'd like to watch it. I highly recommend it. You'll be sucked in. I can't wait to go home and watch it again. I watched it so many times. This is the 15th anniversary this year of Mad Men. It came out July 15th, 2007. So on that date, I rewatched the first episode just to commemorate, along with all of us Maddox in the group. And what's really cool is Deborah Lacey, who plays Carla the maid. So unfortunately, in the world of Mad Men, the issue of different cultures or ethnicities. It's reflected in the fact that people of color in the show, one gentleman is an elevator operator, I guess you could say, basically the person that used to push buttons, which is so interesting that people did that for a living. That, and then there's Carla, she's a maid. And Carla, the maid, Deborah Lacey, is in our Mad Men group, which is so cool. So she'll give some tidbits. Yeah, so we don't see a lot of people of color. There are some Latina actresses later that are maids for Don. But that world in the Mad Men advertising world, there really aren't many women as executives, so let alone people of color. But we see that start to change towards the end of the 60s. We see people of color coming into the agency and working there. So that's a reflection of the change in, the civil rights movement, things like that.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's probably pretty accurate in terms of in the inclusion, or rather lack thereof, in that world, especially in that sector, but just in general at that time too.
Yeah, so I know that sometimes that's a critique, but it tries to be reflective of that time. Another topic that they kind of not skirt around, but they deal with, but not in depth, is homophobia. There's a character on the show that's in the closet gay, and when he's asked, someone makes a pass at him. Lee Garner Jr., who's with Lucky Strike Cigarettes, makes a pass at, his name is Sal. He's in the closet gay, works for the agency. He's in the art department. And Sal turns him down. And because he turns him down, he ultimately loses his job at the agency. And the agency, they look at it as, you take one for the team, even if you're gay or whatever the situation is. So he does lose his job. But it's interesting to see him, when he interacts with people who are out of the closet and very, very open about their sexuality, he's surprised and shocked because, he marries someone because it's expected at that time to marry a woman, to not live your true, authentic life. So, unfortunately with Sal, a lot of people are upset because the last time you see him, he's calling from a phone booth and you don't know what happens to him. He's in a park. There's a bunch of guys kind of walking around, so you don't know, did he hook up? What happened to him? Maybe, we know what's coming in the 80s and the 70s with the AIDS epidemic. What could have potentially happened to his character? So people are kind of upset that they didn't tie up that end. But you can't possibly, in a show, address every little character that comes across. But they do a nice job of tying up a lot of loose ends by the finale.
Yeah, I agree. And I like that they leave some things
open-ended.
untied. I mean, that life is like that. You don't always get the answer. Sometimes someone leaves your life, and that's it. I mean, you
never know.
Else, right?
Yeah. So I appreciated that too.
Now, does Mad Men have the kind of following that would get them supplementary material? I know some shows have released.
You have a Better Call Saul for Breaking Bad.
Right, or they'll have
5 spin-offs Game of Thrones is getting this year.
Or novels or something that's remember this one character? Here's a book about what happens to them after the series. Is there anything like that for Mad Men?
Not really. I think there's been, that's a good question, there's been a lot of talk of, wouldn't it be great to do follow-up on Sally, who's Don's daughter? Maybe she is in the 80s and see what happens to her, because they could have followed the characters later on. I know another show I watched, Deadwood, they did a movie years and years after the show was even on the air. But there really isn't anything other than these kind of passionate groups. There's merchandising. There were Mad Men released Barbie dolls, which I did not buy. I held myself. It was Joan, Roger, Don, and Betty you could buy. They were collector's items. They have collectibles and things of that nature that people really, and some of the things in the series, people try to imitate themselves. There's a great comic scene where there's a chip and dip. Pete gets a chip and dip. Pete marries Trudy. And so they have a registry. They get 2 chip and dips. And people have no idea what this thing is. I don't even know if you guys know the terminology chip and dip.
No idea.
Is that,
oh my gosh!
I'm gonna take a stab at it. Is that one of those it's a bowl that's got a smaller bowl in it that you put dip in? Okay.
Yes. And that's what he explains to them in the scene. They're like, what is this? He's like, you got your fingers in your ears? It's a chip and dip. So it has this little, it looks almost like a tomato where you put the onion dip in there. And then the 2 leaves next to it where you would, actual leaves where you put the chips. So, so some people in my group have searched high and low to get things that come in comparison to that. So there is a movement amongst the people, some of them to live that way, to go out and dress that way. There are people in my group that go and photograph the locations in California and also in New York, and they post them for us because we might not be able to get there. So that's pretty cool, but there is nothing. I bet you there's a hunger for it amongst us diehard fans, but they haven't. In some ways, I appreciate that because he kind of said, listen, I'm not going to maybe revisit it because we don't want to ruin something that was just so, sometimes they revisit it and it's not as good as the original. That happens with a lot of things that we all know and love. So no, there hasn't been, not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I appreciate that too. I think that they're showing restraint in not mining that for more. I think it would be a source of a lot of potentially really good material, but they could also mar the legacy, and I would much rather see it just left as it is, although I would be very, very early in the line to go watch whatever else they would make. I think it's the right call not to do that, but they could for sure. But you mentioned like following Sally, and that actually maybe I could get on board with. That would be more removed in time. It would be later on, and we could see what would happen. But I still would prefer that they not touch it. But you did mention Better Call Saul, and I love that show too. And that one, I think it worked out really well. And I know we're not here to talk about that, but I'll just say I think that it lives up to probably to Breaking Bad.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But I mean, it is kind of the outlier. I can think of a lot of other shows that had their weird spin-offs that were largely forgotten. Off the top of my head, it was MASH had 2, and I can't remember either of their names.
Trapper John MD was one of them.
Yeah, Trapper John had a spinoff, and somebody else from the show had a spinoff, and, nobody remembers them. I guess the only other one that I can remember that was a huge success would be Frasier.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So, it's possible, just unlikely to have a good follow-up to this sort of show, I think.
I think it's great because it leaves it to your imagination. Like we discussed in our group, what could have happened to Sally? Like, what did she do in her life? How did she... Because most of these characters, without being morbid, probably would be in another realm. Let's put it that way. Some of them do die on the show. Some of them, their death is implied. So I think it's great that we just can use our imagination and think about what could have happened to them, Yeah, so spin-offs may or may not work, but there is no... I know that they're talking about there's another example like 6 Feet Under, which is an HBO show, which had a perfect finale. They're talking about doing something with that again, like reviving that. So the book may not be closed on Mad Men. It could come up again. But I think that Matthew Weiner, who's the creator and writer, is very protective of that material. And I know at the time when Mad Men was out, there was a lot of fights with AMC. I think they wanted to include a lot more advertising. Ironic for a show about advertising, and I don't think he was on board with that. Plus, he took time in between releasing the episodes. This was before, he didn't drop many episodes. It wasn't on streaming. I had to wait a whole week. I also had to watch it before people spoiled it for me, all that stuff. So, I just really appreciate the protection and the care he gave to the show. He was involved with The Sopranos before, so he had a lot of cachet. He was a writer on that show, so... Hopefully, if you guys like The Sopranos, not that this is anything like The Sopranos, but Sopranos is seen as, again, one of the top 10 probably television shows of all time, arguably. And so would Mad Men. So.
It's funny that you bring that up, because I have actually heard Don kind of compared in a lot of ways to Tony Soprano, because they're both, as far as like a family goes, Tony's a good guy to his family, mostly. But these people who are kind of just scoundrels, but still so very likable.
Right, yeah.
Which I think we're seeing a lot more of in television these days. Similarly with Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. It's, we're watching what are ostensibly bad people, but they make for excellent television.
Yeah, that too. And I think sometimes when you have someone that's just all good, like, I go back to Full House, and that was a great show when I was a kid, and rest in peace, Bob Saget, but his character, Danny Tanner, was just so perfect and so perky, and that was nice when you were a kid, but that in reality, it's not, people are so complex, and they're not all good or not all bad, and Don is definitely a little bit of both. Tony Soprano being a complex guy, he has a job and he does some despicable things you may not do, and Don does the same thing. But at the end of the day, like, there are people he's a ride or die for certain people. I think he is for Peggy, and I think he is for Anna Draper, that's another conversation. Don Draper's real identity is not Don Draper, and how do I explain this? In the beginning...
I think this one just requires a spoiler.
Yes. Well, it's pretty much revealed in the beginning that Don Draper, who we know, John Hamm plays that character, he assumes that name. His real name is Dick Whitman. So, spoiler. Dick Whitman went to fight in Korea, and Don Draper, who he was alongside with, was killed. So he basically just took on his identity. And the woman that Don, who's not the real Don Draper, was married to a woman named Anna Draper. So he's still married when he assumes this identity of Don Draper. So he has to divorce her to marry Betty. I hope I haven't confused anybody, but that's revealed early on. And it's also the struggle of his identity. He keeps it a secret. And that's when we see towards the end, he's living his authentic life. And when he tells people, I'm not, I've been pretending to be somebody else, the people who are close to him, he lets them in on that crucial secret.
I kind of hate that this is essentially the well-written version of what is probably the worst episode of The Simpsons.
It's thinking the exact same thing.
Because that's literally that's Principal Skinner's backstory, basically.
Really?
In Vietnam, he stole someone else's identity.
Really? Oh no, don't tell me that.
It is almost intentionally never brought up again because that episode is fairly universally hated.
Oh.
But it is kind of funny to me that it's like, I guess this would almost be 10 years after, probably more than 10 years after that episode aired, somebody managed to write that story, but well.
Yeah.
Yeah, if they repurposed it, they put it to good use.
I mean, it was just a thing that actually happened, that this was not uncommon in the Korean War.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because they didn't have that kind of,
the
technology back then. Yeah, so it was easy and he comes, we'll call him Dick Whitman, his life prior to being Don was very traumatic for him. He came from a really poor and difficult background, so he was trying to escape. And this opportunity, it's not like he planned it, but it just kind of landed in his lap. And he took advantage of that and built a whole new life. And what we didn't also talk about is the idea of class. Don is from a very poor background, and as Dick, and he marries Betty. And Betty is from the main line. She went to Bryn Mawr College. She studied Italian. So when he meets her, she's well-to-do. So, by assuming this identity of Don Draper, he can forget about where he came from, his parents living on a farm and the kind of circumstances he grew up in, which is a house of ill repute, let's put it that way. So the idea of class, at that time, to some extent, class affects everyone still to this day, but the idea of someone of very limited means could never marry someone like Betty. So that was part of the perk of him changing his identity, I guess, eventually.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Pete really kind of embodies a kind of waspy upper class mentality. But you mentioned the word morbid, speaking of Pete, morbid before. That reminded me of a pretty interesting aspect of the show. I think the word that Trudy uses is morbid. But when she's showing him, for the end of the series, drawing a new pool for their house, he points out that their child could drown in the pool. And as we notice, as modern viewers, there's no fence around it. It's very unsafe. It's just in the backyard. And she scolds him for being morbid, which probably would be accurate at that time. People probably would generally tend to think that way, but we realize now that's extremely irresponsible.
Yeah.
And that's why we now have that, because there were lots of tragedies where we realized we had to do better. But there are, the fun aspect is looking at these ridiculous things that people did at the time that they thought were normal, that we look at and laugh or cringe, like pregnant women openly smoking and drinking.
Right.
And these other things with safety, the pool. I'm sure there's a million other examples.
How about Pete, carrying a gun around the office? Here's the thing that is really shocking considering what's happened with gun violence. Pete trades in, I think when he returns the chip and dip, it all goes back to the chip and dip. So when he returns it to the department store, they say, we can only give you a store credit. So he gets some sort of rifle. And he brings it into work. He gets on the elevator with the Hollis, who's the elevator guy, and you can see the guy, kind of move over to the side a little bit. And several times throughout the series, you see him in his office with the rifle. And you're like, my God. In fact, he points it, and he's shooting. He's looking around the office like this. You can't see it, but he's holding the rifle and aiming it. And his secretary comes right up to the butt of the rifle and pushes it out of the way. I'm like, oh dear, just thinking about it from a 21st century perspective, that's terrifying. So, something like that falls into what you're saying, when you look at things with your eyes now and the situations, Bill and I have talked about this, that Don and Betty put themselves in. Betty goes to these houses where people are just roughing it, in the late 60s, that notion of these people just left their homes and lived in abandoned buildings and, used rainwater and things like that. So it was dangerous. And she's looking for somebody, and she goes down there when it's close to nighttime on her own. And you're like, oh my God. Don picks up hitchhikers. That's another thing. Hitchhikers are a throwback. You don't see, I guess Uber is kind of like hitchhiking to some extent, but it's vetted hitchhiking, isn't it? I guess you're picking up somebody, putting them in the car, and taking them somewhere. However, he picks up random people and drinks with them, and then they beat the crap out of him and take his money. And you're like, oh my God. And letting random people into your house to talk to you about air conditioners. It's like, would you do that now? No. But it just kind of reminds you of maybe what life might have been like or how you're looking at it from your perspective. You have to lose that to really engage in that world. I enjoyed all those, even though, they scared the bejesus out of me.
Well, I feel like it's a good shock,
Yeah.
It's like, no, this is stuff that really happened, and you have to remember that this is a work of fiction,
Right.
but not out of the, not in the realm of fantasy.
Right.
So it's a neat window into like, okay, these are things that happened. This is stuff people did.
Right.
I think that adds almost a kind of a dark comedic aspect to it.
Yeah.
Yes,
Especially
it
the
does.
guy pointing the rifle
Yes.
around the office is, that's almost like Postal.
Yeah.
You're thinking, oh man, is he really? No, he's just kind of a fool.
Yeah, he is. And you do for a second worry because there are instances where he gets shut down and he's berated and you're like, is he going to take the rifle out and go crazy? But no, that never happened. So that's just an interesting looking at it and thinking to yourself, oh my God, that would never happen today. And if it did, that could be a potential incident. So
on similar lines, I'm reminded of the electroshock treatment that one more or less minor character
Right.
received. That winds up being pretty poignant. But at the time, it was normal enough that people did it, although there is some pushback. I'm not sure when it really fell in favor. Pete, the character who has a connection with this other character, trying to push back and convince her not to do it, and she does do it. But also reminds me of pretty early on, Betty, that's Don's wife, Betty's psychiatrist or psychologist is reporting back to Don, her husband,
Yes.
what she's saying, which is a no-no today. Probably was then, but probably much more common in practice.
Yeah.
right, totally unethical and against every. Yeah, the whole idea of mental health treatment, we already kind of talked about Ginsburg, who's taken away. And Betty also, they talk about her she has the emotions of a child. That's what her psychiatrist reported to her husband. Well, her mom died and she watched her mom die. And the only time she tried to open up to it to someone else, they totally ignored her and looked right through her. So the idea that back then you just sucked it up and dealt with it, nobody cared. It's better to hold it in to let it out. You have to be strong. I think that's really tough to see. So there are a couple of times where we see characters breaking down, and it's super poignant. There's an episode, which is my favorite episode, and I told Bill, you gotta rewatch this. It's called The Suitcase. It's season 4. It's probably one of the best episodes of the entire series. And that's where we see Don cry. And to me, of course, people made crazy memes making fun of it, but in the moment, it is so poignant because you see him finally break down. And that's through reaching a breakthrough moment with Peggy, and someone important to him dies. It's just hard for me as someone who's very emotional and very transparent. It's hard to watch characters have to stifle themselves like that. But that was what was expected and what was accepted at that time.
Yeah, I think you're right. That reminds me also, for the end, when Betty is, spoiler, when she's dying of lung cancer, she doesn't want her kids to know, which seems kind, but really, then what happens? They're going to find out when you're dead, and oh, mom is dead now. That's, in my opinion, a really terrible way to go about life, and really not fair to the kids. They, at least the older one, and I think the older two, do wind up finding out.
Right.
But her plan was not to make a big deal, just be normal and not tell them, I guess, at all. Which I think probably was more acceptable at the time, but to me, that seems unconscionable. Do that to someone else, even though she thought what she was doing was what was best for them.
Yeah, she was saving them the grief or the emotional turmoil. She said, I watched my mother die, I won't do that to you. So in her mind, she's saving them, but she really isn't giving them the ability to grieve, which will haunt them probably for the rest of their lives. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that those kind of things, again, put a lot of things into perspective, especially when you look back in time and you're like, this is how people acted, and not even on a practical level of like, oh, they didn't put a fence around their pool. Like, oh, this is that stiff upper lip, as the phrase originated from Britain, keep calm and carry on. That kind of mentality of just don't talk about it. Just keep doing things. And I think now we look at it back with, through the lens of, wow, that does more damage than, and it's not, the show isn't, preaching a warning or anything, but it does in a way nudge you into thinking, yeah, this is how we used to be and really how we shouldn't be. And it's a good way of talking about emotional control and critiquing it in a way that's digestible without really, coming off as preaching at all.
Right. That's a really good point. I agree with that. I think that the fact that we see the way it is absolutely just reminds us of how important it is to process emotions. So, or else they'll come out in the wrong way. So on the show, a character may berate another character because they're really just upset that someone died. So just that misdirection of emotions and not being able to deal with them. So we see what's unfortunate as someone who loves psychology, psychiatry and psychology are not painted in a great light because, Betty's psychiatrist reports on her. That's unethical. And then we see Ginsburg probably going off to be lobotomized. We see Beth, who Bill mentioned. That's the girl Pete had the electroconvulsive therapy. And she wound up having some memory loss. And that's the other thing. These really extreme treatments that people went through at that time, that was the acceptable way to deal with this type of thing. Either don't talk about it, we'll go fry your brain, we'll go take you and get you lobotomized, instead of let's talk about, how you're feeling. Which is what we do now. We're always well, how do you feel and how are things going and how's life? And that was not the way people interacted, at least in the context of the show. Let me just remind people that doesn't mean this is how everybody's situation was or everybody's family or everybody's workplace, but in the context of the show, you're not talking about it.
That kind of reminds me, and my history serves me right, and my psychology classes tell me, does this ever come across? Because we're talking about the same time of, I believe it was cigarette companies that came up with Type A and Type B personalities.
I should know, but I'm not sure to answer that. But I know that terminology, psych started to hit. I think as we see the series progress, you see people getting. You can Google that.
I am before I go spouting something that's incorrect.
No, yeah. But those two categories are in conversation, and that does come up in psych classes or human development classes. I don't know if it's still seen as definitively two different types of people. You're either one or the other. You could be both. But we do see how psychology and how people do start to talk about, Don at the end goes to more of what would you call that, Bill? That's a retreat, a retreat.
Nowadays they might call it a wellness retreat.
There you go. Add the name wellness to the front of it. Yeah. So, by that time we're seeing people get more in touch with who they are and meditating. So there is a real transition there in some regards. I don't mean to say that, with the mental health. I think with the extreme mental health examples. What did you find, Dave? Yeah,
the Type A and Type B personality theory, which was that essentially split people into two groups of, if you're this way mentally, you're Type A, or, Type B. Right. And that was just kind of a way of explaining things.
Right.
But boiling down to it, yes, there's massive criticism, and it's been debunked.
Right.
But a lot of it was because there were tobacco companies pushing underlying, because it goes back to, basically, it was people were complaining about heart disease,
right?
And there was a link to smoking. Tobacco companies undercut that. So I'm surprised that, because I remember that's when that was happening. Not that I was there, but I guess it doesn't factor into the show. But since they're ad men of cigarettes, I guess if it was a show on cigarettes, it'd be different. But
I mean, to be fair, they do cover a lot of the advertising for cigarettes in the first season, especially. So. That whole idea of how to appeal to people, because they said that with cigarettes, and we don't have to go into cigarettes, but since that is a part of the show, and they are smoking a lot through the show, that's another thing. I showed it to my mother, rest her soul, and her comment after showing her the show was they smoke so much. But I was like, Mom, she smoked. She started smoking when she was 12. So to be fair, that kind of was the way it was. But with the cigarette advertising, they talk about how the idea is to hook new smokers, not even maintain who they have. Because once they got you, they got you. They've got to hook you. So there is a little bit which is fascinating. They do incorporate a little bit of psychology, but not as much as we see probably now, with the field of industrial psychology, organizational psychology, or whatever. So, but the Type A, Type B thing, that's interesting.
It's a non-story, but there we go.
So, do you feel the show gave you any insights into advertising? Because, a lot of the techniques in the 60s and 70s are pretty still commonly used.
I think so. The first thing that comes to mind for me is the idea of trying to make someone feel something. That's, I think, what's going to make them buy. You're giving them a feeling, or you're selling them a feeling, or you're tricking them into a feeling, whatever you want to call it. I think that turned out to be pretty central. I think that's right.
I would agree with that, yeah. I think what it made me feel about advertising is that I would never want to work in that field. Yeah. It's so cutthroat. They sleep overnight. And I'm sure this, maybe not to this degree, but the idea that, you're never really off the clock. You're working 12-hour days. Maybe you sleep in your couch. All their offices have maybe a little couch in them. they stay overnight. I mean, they're never home with their families, so it's they take a 7:00 train home at night, and then they're back in the office the next day. Sometimes they even go back to the office at night. I just think it's, at least how it's depicted, it's not a tough. I mean, the rewards are you get paid a lot of money, and when you get that recognition, that's great. But I think the downside of it is like your family life, your relationships. So I wouldn't want to. But it is interesting to see, the different ideas that they come up with for different campaigns. And I'm sure people who are advertising majors or advertising in their profession probably look at it and say, this is rudimentary. But to us, like amateurs, it's pretty entertaining, I would say.
Yeah, that reminds me of, I think it was called The Carousel. Actually,
what a great episode.
2 recent points that you just made. Don gets home, if I'm not mistaken. He gets home, and it's kind of late. It's not early in bed. He wants to spend some time with him, but he has to work more at home. And then he winds up selling this, originally it was called a wheel. It's like a photo viewer thing from
like a slideshow thing.
Like a slideshow thing. And the company was calling it the wheel. At the end, he winds up calling it the carousel. He sells with this very sentimental idea that it's letting you revisit your past, and he's using his own pictures in the pitch. So again, he's latching a feeling onto it, making it this sort of magical or very special thing that you can feel something about, which is a lot more effective than like, here's this technology, it's called a wheel, and it goes around. No, it's a carousel that's taking you to the past, to your past, to these special moments, which is a useful thing. But really, the thing that's going to make you buy it is the way that you feel about the ad, from the ad.
And may I recommend that episode too? That whole spiel that he does with the carousel, it's called The Wheel, the episode. It's very emotional because you can see Don and Harry runs, maybe this is the only time I liked Harry. He ran out of the meeting because he was so touched, he was like tearing up because it was that poignant of an episode. And what Bill says is right. I mean, Don even mentions, it might be Don or Roger or something, that, advertising is built on happiness, and what is happiness? It's a moment before you need more happiness. So that idea of, also advertising telling you what you want is okay, everything's going to be okay. So that reassurance. That's how they get you to buy the product because, it feels good, it is the right thing, it makes you happy, what have you. So like Bill is saying, it's really built on emotion.
Yeah, I also had this sense through rewatching select episodes, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like they start to notice a tension between advertising and marketing. And marketing is something that's bigger, maybe threatening, maybe even antagonistic in some ways to advertising as they know it. I had this sense that was kind of developing maybe around that time. I don't know, I haven't researched it, but it seemed like the advertising people were kind of uncomfortable and unsure about what is this other thing. What do you think?
I guess marketing, are you talking about, there's episodes where they're talking about creating TV ads and things of that nature, the whole idea that you have to do TV now as opposed to what they were doing before, like artwork?
Part of that, but I think maybe there was also a sense of kind of like building a brand or like a broader thing more so than just, here's this piece that's going into a magazine or on a billboard.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. I had the sense that they were kind of pointing at marketing as a broader thing that may or may not upend or be a threat to advertising as they saw it or as they were practicing it.
I guess there is an episode where they do like Sugarberry Hams, and they do a stunt where they have 2 people. They have the account for Sugarberry Hams. So their idea is to have a stunt in a store where 2 women fight over a ham. And that's supposed to create publicity for it. So that idea of like, and Don's like, don't do these types of shenanigans. You know what I mean? Because the women actually wound up going to jail, I think, and they had to bail them out, and they were still fighting so it turned into a big kerfuffle, but it did sell more hams. So that idea of this stunt type of marketing versus your traditional, like, here's the artwork, here's the television ad, and things like that. So maybe a little bit of that too, like that stunt.
That makes sense. I did not see that in my rewatch, but that seemed like the kind of thing I had in mind there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds funny to me, juxtaposed against, like,
modern marketing techniques.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, because if you've ever seen, like, social media ads, some of them are just people doing really dumb things in a store for, either personal brand or, something. Mm-hmm. And it's just funny to me that, professional organization is like, nah, don't do this. This is, in bad faith. And then you see it just usually people goofing it up because that's usually when it gets posted. But, you see that, it's like, this is supposed to be the professional thing, and then this is versus the modern, like, is that like guerrilla marketing? Is that what they call it?
Guerrilla, viral.
Yeah, so at that time, I guess that was their only foray, and they kind of didn't ask permission from the higher-ups. They just decided to do that and pay them like cash and said to the women, can you just do this? So they went back to the standard way of, so. Yeah, so I don't know if that answered kind of what you were talking about, but I'm sure there was a lot of tension, because the way of advertising was changing, the way you do it, the means in which you do it and how you do it.
Right, yeah.
So.
Does the firm they work for, does it specialize, is there a specialization of what kind of ads they do, or do they do TV, radio, like everything? Do they dabble? What is the sort of business they work for?
Good question. I think that
Which business?
I think you can probably answer this better than I can. Well, first of all, they work at a variety of firms. There's acquisitions and mergers and things throughout this series. But the work they're doing, my impression is that it's largely print, but I know that they're involved in some radio stuff. And I guess they don't. In my rewatch, I remember hearing people say, okay, but how are you going to shoot that? How are you going to put that on TV? So maybe that started to happen more as the series progressed. Mm-hmm. But my overall impression was that it's mostly print, but that might not be fair because I saw just a smattering. Like I said, I read up on it in preparation here. What do you think?
They did do some TV. In fact, they did a shot-for-shot of Bye Bye Birdie with Anne Margaret, and instead of doing... They had hired an actress that didn't quite look, she kind of had red hair, obviously. She resembled her slightly. And it was for a drink. And they had her do the exact same movements, but to this song for Patio. It was the name of a diet soda for women back in the day. And so, yes, they did do some TV, but people said that ad doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because it's not Anne Margaret. So you have a pale imitation of Anne Margaret. It didn't really work. So they did dabble in television. But they, as Bill said, it started out as Sterling Cooper, and it had been in business for years and years. And then we see, there's a great episode. It's called Shut the Door, Have a Seat. I recommend, actually just watch the whole show, but really this is another good episode. And it's basically where at the end of the episode, this Putnam Powell Lowe buys Sterling Cooper. So we see British people moving over and being part of the agency. And Don and Roger, they don't want to be a part of that. So they ask Lane, who we didn't really talk about, he's a character. Jared Harris plays him. He's a great actor. He was in a show called Fringe. He's been in a lot of films. He's actually the son of a famous English actor that I'm forgetting right now, but he comes from a lineage. Anyway, so the British gentleman, Lane Price, fires Don and Roger and the group of them, and they start their own agency, and they work out of a hotel room. And then they become Sterling Cooper Draper Price. So Don's name is in the title, and so is this gentleman, Lane Price. So yes, they have various iterations of their agency, as Bill had hinted at. Eventually they get swallowed up by a real-life firm called McCann Erickson that really did exist. Don was approached by them in the first season. He said, no, I don't want to work for you. It's a sausage factory. Like, I don't want to be part of that. Because it's just like one of these big corporate things, even though, isn't it all corporate in advertising? So he said, no, I don't want to be part of that. But then he winds up having to work for them anyway, which is pretty much his worst fear come to life. But many of the products they sell, Lucky Strike is like their main business in the first couple of years. And eventually, because of the cancer claims, and Lee Gardner Sr., who's the head, starts to cognitively decline, so he's not in charge anymore. And there's too much pressure because of people getting cancer. So that goes away. But we see things like Dow Chemical, which is responsible for napalm, which is kind of controversial. So a funny part in the show is where they're trying to get Joe Namath, who is a famous football player, sing for, and do this special, and the commercials in between would be for Dow Chemical, who makes like chemical weapons and such. But they also make, I think, cookingware or something. So, so they represent a lot of different Hershey's, different things come and go. But Lucky Strike was like 23 million of their billings, so that was a pretty big part of their advertising. Sorry, I could talk about this forever. I have a feeling that I'm going on too long, but it's it's just there's so much that's packed in there that we didn't even touch on so many major things. There's a lot of characters that we didn't even get a chance to talk about. So my recommendation would be watch the show and enjoy it, and you won't stop thinking about it.
Yeah, definitely. It really stays with you. As far as I'm concerned, this is really top shelf TV. I know there's a lot of great TV I haven't watched, but I have watched some really great things. And to me, this is at the top with Breaking Bad and The American. Those are my top three so far. And they're all, I could go on for a while about other great shows that I've watched that I would put a tier below this. I put this really at the pinnacle of television. And
if the director of the library says that, that means something.
You know it's good. Seal of approval.
Were there any final thoughts you wanted to share, or any... Well, I mean, I guess we've already covered the recommendations for where to start. It's really just the one piece of media.
You start at the beginning, as it sounds like is the best place.
It never fails to really surprise you, the show. Even from the first episode, the ending is a surprise. You're like, whoa, I did not see that coming. Now, when I say this, don't get thinking like there's some explosion. I think when we're so used to these big reveals, right? And Mad Men can be a slow burn at times. So it's not that it comes out the gate and you're like, this is different. This is fantastic. But I just want people to know, there are surprises. There are things that come that shock you. And it's just so entertaining.
I agree. Definitely, you should watch it. It'll stay with you. It's the kind of show I think you can just watch without thinking too much about, but it is very thought-provoking, and if you do give it that attention and make that effort, I think you'll find it really interesting. Find a lot to think about.
And also it makes me feel and yearn for the technology of where they introduce, I'm sorry to bring something up at the last minute, but they introduce like a typewriter to Peggy and they're like, it's so, a man designed it so simple so even a woman can use it type of thing. Or a photocopier. They bring a photocopier in an office and it's the size of like a small bedroom. And they're like, where are we going to put this? And the one, Joan says, you don't understand, girls. This is a gift to you because now they used to have to type everything out and use carbon copies or whatever they did. Maybe they had to type 5 versions of the same letter. Now they just photocopy it. So the idea, too, of technology and how that changes advertising might be interesting to someone else, too. It's not just about relationships. It's not just about office politics. It's not just about the culture. There's so many aspects of it that, it's interesting to see the evolution from the beginning to the end.
Thank you both for joining us. It was a pleasure having you both.
I'm heavily considering watching the show.
It's been on my to-do list for forever, but unfortunately my to-do list at this point is longer than my expected lifespan, so...
Well, if you get the chance, you will enjoy it. Thank you.
Yeah. Sure.
Thank you for talking to us about it. I can't wait to go home and start from the beginning. That's what I do. I watch the end and I actually get sad because the characters have changed so much or some of them died. I'm like, I have to go back to when they were still alive and everything was okay. So I'll go back and start from the beginning. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, well, this has been Geek Out at the Lansdowne Library. If you, too, would like to come on the show and talk about something you're passionate about, you can sign up on our website.
lansdownelibrary.org/podcasts. If you'd like to, there's a green register here button, which will allow you to, let us know what you'd like to talk about. It's also where you can find every episode of our show so far.